When someone came up behind Vito Corleone and smacked him over the head with a bottle, he didn't even turn around to look at them. Instead, Vito just continued his business discussion. That person had to hit him several times before Vito finally stopped talking. Even then, he didn't seem that angry or upset. So who was this man and why did he do this? The year was 1945 and the place was New York City. Don Vito Corleone was one of the most powerful crime bosses in the country. Despite being over 60 years old, Vito still ran his criminal empire like he was in his prime. He made millions of dollars every week through illegal activities such as gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. However, these businesses were under constant threat from rival gangs and law enforcement officials. Vito knew that at any moment he might be targeted for assassination by one of his many enemies. But he wasn't worried. He had hired some of the best bodyguards in the business to protect him, and they were always by his side whenever he left the house. But even though Vito took all these precautions, he never felt completely safe. There was always a part of him that wondered if he would end up being taken out by an enemy, and this fear would often keep him up at night. One day, Vito was meeting with some associates in a local bar when a group of men walked in and sat down at the next table. Vito knew right away that something was wrong. These guys weren't like the other patrons in the bar. They were loud and obnoxious, and they kept staring at him. Vito's bodyguards noticed them too, and they started making their way over to Vito's table. The bodyguards were big, burly men with thick necks and shaved heads. They looked like they could break someone's neck without breaking a sweat. The men at the other table saw the bodyguards coming and they started to get nervous. They began to whisper amongst themselves, and suddenly they all stood up and walked out of the bar. Vito's bodyguards followed them out into the street, but they lost them in the crowd. Vito wasn't worried about these guys. He knew that they weren't a threat to him. He'd seen the fear in their eyes, and it was clear to him that they were just common thugs. But what Vito didn't know was that these men were part of a gang that had been hired to kill him. They had followed him to the bar, and they had planned to ambush him when he came out. But when they saw Vito's bodyguards, they knew that they were no match for those men. So they backed off and made plans to try again another day, and try again they did. A few weeks later, Vito was walking down the street when he heard a noise behind him. He turned around and saw a man running towards him with a gun in his hand. Vito's bodyguard saw the man too, and he reacted quickly. He tackled the gunman to the ground and wrestled away his weapon. Vito wasn't hurt, but he was shaken. This was the closest he had ever come to death, and it made him realize that he couldn't let his guard down, no matter how much he trusted his bodyguards. As the years passed, Vito became more and more paranoid. He started to think that everyone was out to get him, even people he loved. He became convinced that his own family members were plotting to take over his empire, and that they would kill him if it meant getting more power. Of course, this wasn't true, but Vito never realized that. His paranoia grew and he became more isolated. He spent most of his time alone in his mansion, surrounded by his weapons and bodyguards. He knew that he was being followed and watched all the time, so he started to keep his head down and avoid drawing attention to himself. But there was one place he couldn't avoid: his son's wedding. Vito had 5 children with his wife, but only one of them was a legitimate son. His other 4 children were born out of wedlock, and they lived with their mothers. Vito's legitimate son, Sonny, was getting married, and Vito was determined to make it the biggest event of the year. He spared no expense on the wedding. There were hundreds of guests in attendance, and the reception was held at one of Vito's mansions. Of course, Vito's rivals and enemies were watching the wedding from afar. They knew that it would be heavily guarded, so they had no plans to disrupt the ceremony. But as the wedding reception was in full swing, a group of gunmen opened fire on the mansion. People ran for cover as bullets shattered windows and tore through walls. Vito's bodyguards returned fire, but they couldn't tell where the gunmen were hiding. It was every man for himself, and Vito found himself separated from his wife and children. He ran for cover, taking bullets and glass as he went. Finally, he found his wife and children hiding in a bathroom. They were safe, but Vito knew that his enemies would soon find them. They fled the mansion and got into a car. Vito drove them all to his secret hideaway, where he kept most of his money and valuables. Figured that his enemies wouldn't think to look there, and they never did. Vito and his family lived in hiding for several months. During that time, Vito became even more paranoid than before. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, and he didn't trust anyone. He even began to suspect that his own wife and children were betraying him. Finally, the coast was clear, and Vito and his family were able to return to their lives. But the experience had changed Vito forever. He was now more suspicious and paranoid than ever before. He knew that his enemies would keep trying to take him out, so he redoubled his efforts to stay safe. He hired more bodyguards, and he had them follow him everywhere he went. He also started carrying a gun with him at all times. But even with all these precautions, Vito knew that he was living on borrowed time. He had been shot at, stabbed, and bombed several times, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before one of the attacks actually landed. And that brings us back to the beginning of this story. Don Vito Corleone was sitting in a bar talking to some associates when a man came up behind him and hit him over the head with a bottle. Vito didn't even turn around to look at him. He just kept talking as if nothing had happened. That man had to hit him several times before Vito finally stopped talking. Even then, he didn't seem that angry or upset, just looked at the man who had attacked him and said, "What?" That one simple word was all it took to send the man over the edge. He lunged at Vito, but this time, Vito's bodyguard stepped in and punched the man so hard that he fell to the ground unconscious. Vito looked at his bodyguard and shook his head. "It's all right," he said. "I'll handle this." And handle it he did. Vito got up from his seat and walked over to the man, looked down at him and said, "You should have killed me when you had the chance." With that, Vito pulled out a gun and shot the man dead. Now, if you're wondering who this guy was and why he tried to kill Vito, the answer is simple. He wasn't trying to kill Vito, at least not personally. You see, the bar where this story took place was owned by a rival crime boss named Virgil Salazzo, and he had hired the man who attacked Vito as his bodyguard. What Virgil didn't know was that Vito had already made plans to take over his bar, and when he found out, he was furious. He sent his bodyguard to kill Vito, but it didn't work out. In the end, Vito took over the bar, and Virgil had to watch helplessly as his empire crumbled around him. So there you have it, the story of how Vito Corleone got his comeuppance. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe for more content. Till next time, remember to stay safe out there.